Any of them closer?
No, that's good. Go.
Okay.
You're ready, go.
All right, we are going to look at the 3 levels of vertebrae. This is your cervical vertebrae. You have your thoracic vertebrae and your lumbar vertebrae. Now you can tell your cervical vertebrae apart from the other 2 because it has 3 holes. You can tell your thoracic vertebrae because when you look at it, it actually looks like a giraffe. And when you look at your lumbar vertebrae, it is distinguishable because it looks more like a moose, and it's more of a profile than it is directly on. So we're going to do basic structures for all vertebrae, and then we'll do special structures for each level. You always start with the body. The body is on all 3 levels, cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. You have the vertebral foramen, which is going to go down the center, and then you're going to have what we call the spinous process. The spinous process is going to be on the tip right here for each level, but we're going to pay attention to the cervical vertebrae. It does fork. We call this a bifid spinous process. Okay, the next things are transverse process. On either side, the furthest thing lateral, you have the transverse process. So transverse process on the thoracic vertebrae and transverse process on the lumbar vertebrae. Okay, in between the transverse process and the spinous process, directly in the center, it's called the lamina. So the lamina and the lamina. If we look on the cervical vertebrae, it's got the lamina. Here's the lamina. And then on the lumbar vertebrae, just directly in the center between the transverse process and the spinous process is the lamina. Okay. Additional structures include the pedicle. The pedicle is the piece of bone that connects the body to the rest of the vertebrae. It is literally a bar of bone that is called the pedicle. Here's the pedicle, here's a pedicle. On the thoracic vertebrae, the pedicle is found here and here. And then on the cervical, it looks a little different. This right here is called the pedicle. It's the bar of bone that connects the body to the rest of the vertebrae. Okay, each vertebrae has to be able to articulate or form a joint to make the vertebral column. And how they do that are called facets. There's a set on top for each one called the superior articulating facets. If you go to the thoracic, superior articulating facets. I always say these look like the horns of the giraffe. And then you have the superior articulating facets on the moose, and that literally is on the inside right here. So transverse process, superior articulating facets. Now each level has inferior ones. If you turn the vertebrae over where the spinous process is pointing up, just like that, this is the inferior articulating facets. Turn this one over, inferior articulating facets. And then the last one, on the moose, I always say it's the beard. This is your inferior articulating facet. It is on the bottom. Facets usually look circular, they're round, they're smooth, and that's how you know that they're the facets. Superior means on top, inferior means on bottom. When we look at the cervical vertebrae, there is, again, 2 distinguishable things about the cervical. In the transverse process, you do have a foramen, so these are called transverse foramen. And then again, the spinous process is called bifid spinous process. Thoracic vertebrae are the only vertebrae that articulate with their ribs, and our word root for ribs is costal. So the ribs are going to attach on the side of the body. So on the top, this would be called the superior costal facet. This would be your inferior costal facet, and the ribs, when they attach, they also attach to the transverse process, and then they wrap around. So it's superior costal facet, inferior costal facet, and then they attach right here on the transverse process. So we call this the transverse costal facet. And those are all the special structures of the vertebrae and their regular structures.